Welcome back everyone. Today we have a very exciting video. It's been a long time and I've been planning this video for a long time. Today we are going to be talking about how we can apply a subsurface scattering material, how it works, why it works that way, and different types of results, how we can mess around with different kinds of parameters and get a certain type of look. Subsurface scattering is really interesting when it comes to thin walled objects, for example your nose, your ears, fingers, and so on. Now we are going to be talking all about that, so let's get into it. So this will be the result that we are going to be doing today that you see on the IPR window, and we are going to be building the shader from the sketch. So let's get into it. I'm going to stop the IPR here and let me just show you my scene. So as you can see, I have a simple backdrop here, 3 area lights and cameras, and that's it. So let me just start off by simply deleting all these lights and delete. Let me just pause this, delete. Right, so we have no light whatsoever, and I'm going to apply a fresh material so we can start off fresh. Let's call this new subsurface scattering and let's turn this on. Alright, let's turn it. So the first thing we have is the base. Let's have some lights, so just so we can see how our scene is looking. So I'm going to take an area light and let's bring this up, let's scale this up, something like this, and I'm going to rotate this to about 90 degrees. Let's bring it right around here, something like this. Okay, now I'm going to do the same by simply, let's add more lights later on as we go through, and let's see. I'm going to increase the exposure on this to 4, maybe 6, 8. Okay, so 8 seems fine. And I'm also going to reduce the test resolution to somewhere around 75. I think that seems fairly good enough. So the first thing I'm going to do is go back to my main camera, and we have a perfect proportion going on. I'm going to select my model here and go to subsurface scattering. Now subsurface scattering, what is subsurface scattering? It simulates the effect of light entering an object and scattering beneath the surface. That means if the light is coming through the sun or any external device, that light will pass through that object, that light will pierce through that object and kind of scatter along. If you want to look at some example, you can turn on your flashlight on your phone and kind of close that flashlight with your fingers, and you'll see some subsurface scattering going on. You'll see that even though you're blocking the overall flashlight, it's kind of scattering that orange light behind the overall fingers of yours, and that effect is called the subsurface scattering. If you go out in the sun, you'll start to see that your nose and your ears start to look a little bit translucent, and the reason is because of the subsurface scattering effect. So let's see how we can build this. So I'm going to start off by, you can keep the base if you want or turn it off, it doesn't really matter for the subsurface scattering. So let's zoom in just a bit and select this. Now let's go to the subsurface. Alright, so this is the subsurface menu. I'm going to make the weight to 1, and weight is basically the overall how much subsurface scattering you want on a certain object. And I'm going to make this again test resolution 100 and update the full scene. Alright, so as you can see, we have this kind of a glassy look going on, and that is because the light is passing through our object. Now I'm going to add a little bit of render region right around here just so we can see a little bit faster. And the one thing to keep in mind, if you're working with subsurface scattering or anything transparent, make sure you turn off the opaque. And opaque is basically something that treats an object as a matte object, as a non-transparent object. So we have to make sure that our object is set to not opaque. So I'm going to select my object here, and I'm going to go to the shape of it, shape parameters, go to Arnold, and make sure you turn this off. By default it will be like this, and you have to turn this off. Alright, so anyways, select this, go to the subsurface menu, and now we are all ready to go. Now the first thing we have is the weight. As I said, weight determines how much subsurface scattering you want on a certain object. So I'm going to keep the weight to 1. Now the second thing is the color, and this determines the color of your subsurface. You can change any color you want, like for example this, and as you can see, it looks, you can see a little bit of subsurface scattering going on right about here. And the good thing about this is you have a number of presets about the subsurface scattering color. If you click on the name, you'll get all these presets, but you have inbuilt colors, and you can pretty much play around with this. And as you can see, we have this interesting looking material going on now, which looks pretty interesting. Now you can click on the skin as well. So you have the skin material as well. You can choose skin 2, whole milk, cream, and etc. So it's pretty nice that they have given these presets to work with. So I'm going to keep it to something like ketchup. I think it looks pretty good, and maybe change the color just a little brighter. All right, so the second thing we have is the radius. Now the radius determines how much distance up to which the light is going to be scattered below the surface. And that means the more higher value you have, and by higher value I mean the brighter the color is, the more subsurface scattering effect there is going to be. The lower the value is, the more darker result you're going to get. So if you want more subsurface scattering going on, you can make this white, and as you can see, our object is becoming more and more glassy towards the white. That means more light is kind of passing through it. And if I make this somewhere a little darker, as you can see, our object becomes complete matte. So this is how you control how much you want the light to be scattered. The more, you can say, the lighter the color is, the more scatter is going to happen. So if you want more scattering going on, you can keep it to white. And if you want less, you can keep it to black. So you can keep in between if you want to control that by using a gray value. You can also choose some other color if you want, and that will just contribute the overall subsurface scattering. Now the second thing we have is the scale, and the scale value is kind of the one of the most important thing we have in the subsurface scattering, because it controls the distance that the light is likely to travel under the surface. And by distance, if I make the scale to somewhere like 0.100, as you can see, less subsurface scattering is happening around right about this part and somewhere around this part, right? Now what this means is basically light is going inside the object, but it's not going all the way. It's stopping right here and it's bouncing back outside. So if we make the value more higher, we are allowing the light to get inside of our object even more. So let me just update the full scene. And as you can see, this is how the result is looking. So I'm going to change this, and as you can see, now it's getting less and less darker. So the radius and the scale kind of contributes to each other, and you can make the value higher, and that will just make the whole subsurface scattering look totally goes under the radius section. And what do I mean by that? That means the overall radius we have, the lighter color we have, it's pushing towards that, making sure that the light is passing through it, the higher the value is. So one thing to keep in mind, that a radius and scale are mostly going to work together. So you have to kind of, you're choosing the color, like for example this blue color, and then you are choosing how much scale. As you can see, the color is pretty dark, that's why the scattering effect is not that much. So if I choose something like maybe cyan, you can see a little bit of that. So I'm going to make this cyan just a little bit lighter. And as I make it a little lighter, as you can see, we have more subsurface scattering going on. And if I don't want that much subsurface scattering, if I want to control that the light should be only piercing around this part, maybe I can reduce the amount and we can have only that much scattering going on. So that way you can pretty much have the control over your subsurface scattering, that how much area you want the scale to be affected on. So this is pretty interesting. So you choose a color, you determines how much it should pierce through your object, and that's how you control the subsurface scattering look. And that's it. So the next thing we have is the type. Now type is kind of a pretty interesting thing. Now we have two types of subsurface scattering. The first is diffuse, which is a pretty basic one, which is a single layer subsurface scattering. And if we select diffuse, it has something like this, which I highly suggest not using, because diffuse is not kind of an accurate one. If I make this something like white, and let me just update the full scene. As you can see, diffuse is pretty hard to control, and let me just choose something like a skin. So this is kind of the effect you're getting. And if you use the random walk, it's more precise. That's why. And over the years, Maya Autodesk has added more and more kind of upgrade to this look. So they have added a new random walk version 2, which is even more precise. So I highly suggest always use random walk version 2. It's pretty more kind of a robust method. And I'm going to use the ketchup again and make sure it is set to random walk v2. The random walk v2 is the method kind of a more accurately and deeply through high transparent objects. So it kind of evenly scattered the lights. So it's kind of a mathematically correct. So if you want to read about these doc files, the doc file will be in the description. If you want to read about the random walk and the diffuse, it will be in the description, so you can learn more about this. So I'm going to make the scale to somewhere like 0.5 or maybe like 0.6, and maybe change the color to something like this. Okay, so I think it looks good. Yeah. So as you see, this is exactly the material that we have created in the beginning of the video. So we can pretty much play around with how much color of the subsurface scattering you want on this. I can make this even darker or lighter. And then we have the anisotropy, and the anisotropy is something that scatters the light evenly in all directions. Now, what do I mean by this? Now, to understand anisotropy, you have to understand the more value. Let's keep it as a positive value and a negative value. If you make the value positive, it will be in the direction of the light. On the other hand, if the value is negative, it will have kind of a bias scattering backwards effect. Now, what do I mean by that? If I make the value to something like positive 0.5, or maybe like, let's have a good amount of value so we can see. So as you can see, the more positive value have a kind of a forward effect towards the subsurface scattering. On the other hand, if I make this somewhere like a negative value, the scattering will be on the backward side, more on the opposite side where the light is coming from. All right. So I hope it makes sense. For example, if I make a render region right about there, all right, and let's keep the anisotropy to 0, and we'll let it render, and we'll take a snapshot of this. All right. Now we'll do one more thing. We'll add something like maybe a 0.9, and we'll let it render, and we'll take another snapshot. Now we'll make the value decrease to somewhere like this, and let's hit snapshot. So in the first image, as you can see, it has been set to 0, and in the second image, as you can see, since the value has been set to a positive 940, that's why it gives you kind of a more subsurface scattering effect. The more anisotropy there is, the more subsurface scattering there's going to be towards where the light is coming from. So anisotropy totally depends from where the light is actually coming from. It totally depends on the light. Now if I make the value to negative, as you can see, it becomes even darker. So this is a kind of a 0, and this is the darker one where you have the negative value. So now I hope you all understand how the anisotropy works. So it's really gradual to understand, but if you'll experiment more with this, you'll try to get a knack of it. So I'm going to turn this off, and let's turn this off, and let's add more light to our scene. So I'm going to close this for now, and I'm going to select this light, Control D, and I'm going to simply make this, instead of -14, let's say 14 in the positive, and instead of -90, let's make it 90. So we have two lights on the opposite direction. Now let's add one more light. Let's hit Control D, and I'm going to make the translate X to 0, and let's put it backwards, and let's rotate this to somewhere like 180, I guess. Yeah. So let's bring this back. Okay. So I'm going to go to my main camera. Let's go to the outliner. Let's select this. Let's call this key light. This will be our fill light, and this will be our backlight. Okay. So let's go back to our main camera. Let's turn on our IPR, and so now as you can see, the scene looks pretty bright, and the reason is because we have too many lights. And to control this scene now, what we are going to do is we are going to go to the Windows, Relationship Editor, Light Linking, Light Centric, and I'm going to say to my light that, to the fill light, I'm going to say to my light that I want you to effect on my Buddha statue, but not on the backdrop. So if I turn this on, and I'm going to deselect this, all right, so as you can see right now, the fill light is not affecting the backdrop at all. And I'm going to select my backlight, and I'm going to say don't have any light intensity on the backdrop. So now as you can see, the scene looks good. So the light is only affecting our model, all right, and only light that is affecting the backdrop is the key light. So now the scene looks pretty good. Let's close this. And now what you can do to make the scene even more interesting, I'm going to select the backlight. I'm going to keep the intensity to a little lower than the original intensity. I think we have 8. So I'm going to make this somewhere like 6, and I'm going to select my fill light, and I'm going to make this somewhere like 4, maybe 6. Yeah. So just so we have more subsurface scattering going on with our key light, I'm going to increase the number of samples we have on the subsurface scattering so we see more of that effect, and you can increase the sample as well. I'm going to maybe change the intensity to 9. Okay, so I think now the scene looks pretty good. Now comes the experimental part. Now to experiment with this, what you can do is play around with different kinds of parameters. Now I'm going to do something of my own, maybe like change the color to something like blue, and I'm going to select this and maybe change on the same family to something like a lighter cyan color. And now as you can see, we have this kind of, maybe add more subsurface scattering to this to maybe 0.5 or 4. All right, and anisotropy will be 0. So let's, yeah, so I think now it looks pretty good. Now you can combine this effect with a little bit of transmission. You can add some transmission with this, maybe 0.2, 0.5, and I'm going to change the color to something like this. All right, and I'm going to increase this to 0.9 just to see how much it's kind of gathering the overall light. 0.6 is good enough, and I'm going to make the depth to 0.200 for now and change the scatter effect to a little bit darker color. All right, so we have a little bit of glassiness going on. If you don't have any idea on the transmission, I've already made a video on call as how to create a glass material, so you should check that out. I've explained all the parameters of this. And moving on, I'm going to change the specular roughness to maybe like 0.100, and also the IOR to something like maybe 1.3. that is a refraction value of water. You can also click on your IOR and you can get all these parameters where you, if you don't remember the IOR value of any certain object, like for example, if you want diamond, it's 2.420, so you have a diamond refraction value. And as you can see, our material is kind of giving a different kinds of look now. So play around with this. You can have a little bit of fun with this. I'm going to change the value on this to make a more subsurface scattering look. And from the back, as you can see, our backlight is kind of contributing to our scene. You get all these nice little light wrapping going around the edges. You can even, if you want, select the light and change the color to something like this to match the overall scene, and that will just helps you with the overall composition. So I think you have everything you need to know with the subsurface scattering. If you have any doubt, feel free to ask me. If you want to read more about the subsurface scattering effect, the doc file will be available in the description. So you can go to the Autodesk website and you can read about it. And apart from that, I think it's pretty straightforward, simple. Always make sure you use random walk 2, and remember radius and scale contributes to each other. The more lighter the color is, the more effect there's going to be. The darker the color, the less effect there's going to be. Scale determines how much light is going to pierce through the skin or the object. So the more value you have, the more light is going to pass through. All right, so you can limit the light with these values. All right, so anisotropy will contribute towards the light. All right, as you can see, we are getting more of that bluish color. If I make the negative value, as you can see, it's getting kind of on the opposite direction where the light is coming from. That is the front side, because we don't have any light on the front. So I'm going to keep it to, I think, maybe 0. And the weight determines how much subsurface there is going to be. So it's pretty straightforward. If you play around with this, you'll get more idea how these parameters work, how you can create your own custom shaders with this. So subsurface scattering is really interesting thing. And one thing to keep in mind, there are 2 types of rays that goes into when it comes to creating. There's the first is the reflected rays, the second is the scattered rays. Now what we want is the scattered rays that gives us the subsurface scattering effect. That is just something you should know when you're working. So the reflected rays are something that instantly bounce off of your object, and subsurface scattering rays are something that pierce through your skin. So just something you should know. And subsurface scattering is one of those things that mostly sun and pretty lightweight object, like for example a leaf, fingers and nose and ears, something like that has. So have some good references to look into. Then I suggest diving into this shader, have a good examples to kind of work with, and then I highly suggest creating your own shaders. Maybe mess around more with these kind of parameters to get to know more. Maybe add a little bit of coat in this to get extra shininess, and maybe you can increase the roughness if you want to be rough in material. I've been getting a lot of requests for the subsurface scattering since I created the geoboil shader. Actually not the shader, the geoboil effect on Maya, and everybody was wondering how I created that shader, and this is how I created those shader. And if you want, there will be an in-depth video of how I created the geoboil shader exactly, and it will be up by tomorrow, so stay tuned. And again guys, thank you for watching. If you have any question, feel free to ask me regarding anything, and if you have any idea on the next video, please mention in the comment section. Alright guys, thank you for watching. Enjoy.